Gen Z movies are in a crisis. No, truly, they are. Like, if the big earthquake or the prehistoric dinosaur ending asteroid were to hit again at this very moment, it would miss all of us and strike directly at Netflix studios. That's how bad it is right now. I'm sure of it. And obviously, I am no expert at this at all. My thoughts are my own, but I just had some quick thoughts on this topic and I never quite knew how to say it, so I wrote some things down to help me out. But if this feels all over the place, just pretty please bear with me. Throughout the years, I've spent far too long watching and studying content made for Gen Z watchers. And as far as TV, I think they really hit it out of the park with quite a few successes that will last in the pop culture sphere. But when I think about movies, specifically comedies, I think we are in very dire times. The official ages of Gen Z range from 12 to 27, with the average being 19. So it's safe to say, with such a large gap, there's going to be differing opinions on what is considered likable, or in this case, tolerable. When I was in school, I believe the biggest teen comedy at the time was On My Block, a show produced by Netflix that released in the late 2010s and was original IP. And now the most popular comedies today would most likely be Wednesday, XO Kitty, or Heartstopper. Again, still both Gen Z, but it's gotten so much harder to get these kinds of projects off the ground unless they're tied to something else. But most original TV comedies, even back then, were canceled pretty ruthlessly and weren't shown much mercy. For every success, there were several Daybreaks or Julie and the Phantoms, Insatiables, Everything Sucks, American Vandals, and so on. According to studies, the most consumed genres amongst Gen Z are comedies, animation, and romance films. And so far, besides animation, only very few films come to mind that hold much of a staying impact. And a lot of that has to do with choices. We watchers are given many choices, from several streaming services all telling us to pick something at the same time, hoping it'll occupy us long enough to count as a legitimate view. It's no longer organic, it's algorithmic. The last show I remember that broke boundaries through word of mouth was The Bear. Some may say it's a comedy, some may not, but nevertheless, it's something that worked and clearly represented the millennial generation. Oftentimes, I see a lot of people my age longing for more representation in our media, and when it comes to comedies, they want something that can be like a Seinfeld or a New Girl, but modern day. Something simple and bingeable with some relatable writing, which sounds easy enough. But I've come to the realization that we won't be getting anything like that for a long while. And that's basically because although most of us are considered adults, it'll take some time before the general public sees us that way. As of now, we are unfortunately still stuck in the young adult limbo of high school and maybe college. Even in the K-dramas I watch, being the same age as the actors I grew up seeing, they still have no choice but to put on those uniforms. And I know they're pushing 30, I know it. But a check is a check. Out of the most recent Gen Z comedies, I thought about two of the most popular, which wasn't very hard because there wasn't much competition. But I just thought I'd go over what made them hits in the first place and how they're perceived now. Starting with 2022's Do Revenge. Fresh off the Stranger Things buzz and Riverdale buzz and Outer Banks buzz and 13 Reasons Why buzz and a bunch of other buzzes came a really fun idea about a popular and a reject coming together to socially destroy their opponents. Written by Jennifer Caton Robinson, this film was loosely inspired by the 1950s psychological thriller Strangers on a Train, as well as 10 Things I Hate About You, Jawbreaker, Scream, and other 90s flicks, all wrapped into a tongue-in-cheek Gen Z setting. It had a suitable budget, a Sarah Michelle Gellar cameo, a popular cast of up-and-comers, and tons of engagement, only for it to underperform. To me, this really was like the Super M of Netflix teen movies, and it did so badly and no one saw it coming. There are very few ratings from that company I'd ever believe to be true, but something about this movie debuting with 26 million views felt the most honest it's ever been to me. It even apparently jumped to like 42 million within its first full week, which isn't exactly a flop, but it isn't the kind of numbers Netflix would aim for, because as much as people may claim to appreciate it, this film is barely mentioned today, like at all. We got about 2 memes out of it and hung it out to dry. And honestly, I don't think there's anything to necessarily blame here. I genuinely felt like everyone involved tried to do something different with this premise, but for whatever reason, it just didn't stick with the younger crowd. Maybe it was a case of playing so hard into the nostalgia factor that they forgot to keep a grounded storyline, because I do recall it being very messy and busy at the same time, but at the end of the day, it just didn't hold. Another movie that comes to mind is Bottoms. And before you start, okay, we need to have an honest conversation about Bottoms. Argue with me in the comments if you want, I do not care. I am strictly here to speak my piece, and I am going to do that. Released in 2023, this film was highly anticipated and starred former Stan Twitter legends Io Adebari and Rachel Sennett, with the hook pretty much being Fight Club but gay. And this was all set in high school. Unlike most comedies today, this film was also given a theatrical release, and it did decently. In fact, I remember there being a lot of upset that it was only in select theaters, because it most likely would have made way more if given the opportunity. But alas, there may have been some hesitation in taking that big of a leap. But when it finally hit streaming, there was once again a lot of buzz surrounding the movie, and it was welcomed with open arms online. People would share clips and talk about how great everyone's performance was and how happy they were to finally see it. And then it was quiet. It barely even mentioned now, once again. And again, not for nothing, this movie was not bad. If you want my opinion, I thought it was fine. But if the only driving force you have to keep a movie afloat is strictly star power and having no story that makes the audience want to re-watch it, you can't help but question the impact. And unfortunately, neither of these once very popular Gen Z catered movies had impact. And that's what brought me to something I hadn't really considered, but may be the honest truth. Gen Z doesn't actually like modern comedies as much as they think they do. If you were to ask Gen Z what were some of their most favorite comedies that they still rewatch, it will most likely not be anything under a decade old. It will also most likely be something that is tied to their own nostalgia, but was released before the streaming age. I strangely think a lot of my generation tends to be a bit guarded when it comes to things that are in the comedy sphere now, which is understandable. Most of us don't prefer jokes about punching down on certain communities, but if they do engage and the jokes don't land, there are no second or third chances they're just gonna click off. And my generation does not hold back on criticism either, especially if it's shared online. It's instant and can be a hot topic pretty quickly for all the wrong reasons. But at the same time, if you were to put on something like Rush Hour or White Chicks, that guardedness goes away, because we know what it is, we know it'll be abrasive and offensive and punchy, and yet it's still funny to the masses because it wasn't our time, it's not connected to us, and it was more universal. So for the things that do represent us, I think it makes sense that we tend to get more protective about it, because Gen Z knows the image we've been given, and the older we get, the more hostile the conversation gets. We are the first generation to have grown up throughout our entire lives with accessible electronics, so it makes sense that we're often portrayed as phone-addicted young people in media, especially in comedies. Even millennials had that label for a bit, but I think we're in an awkward time where our gap is so all over the place, Gen Z isn't seen as anything else. We don't have varying tropes on screen because most writers, who are older, just aren't interested in exploring that part of us yet. And it's a pretty safe go-to. Though it is repetitive, it's not offending anyone. I just think there's more potential there if and when they're ready to look into it. By 2030, Gen Z will make up around 30% of the workforce, which is estimated to be around 50 million jobs. More than half of us live paycheck to paycheck, are depressed, and about 40% of us are delusional enough to think we're going to own a home one day. I mean, there's got to be some funny material in there somewhere. When I graduated, I couldn't wait until the influx of college TV shows because I was under the impression that as more of us grew up, our media would as well. And there was Grownish, which wasn't great, but you gotta start somewhere. And then we just sort of stayed in high school for some reason. While I agree that a lot of firsts can happen in that period, the media today really does make it seem like it's the end all be all. And it's kind of insane to me because way back in the day, companies were throwing tons of cash at college continuations and spin-offs. They wanted their audience to grow with the characters, even if that meant paying actors more, because the ratings were usually a sure thing. To me, the only film catered to Gen Z that still sticks is To All the Boys I've Loved Before. And that was a straight to streaming, awesomeness TV produced movie that absolutely no one saw coming nor cared about, and yet it beat all odds and became a worldwide hit. What were the main factors I helped to get there? For one, it was a romantic comedy, and that's a genre that is longed for. Two, it knew the demographic it wanted, a story involving an introverted teenager that showcases a healthy version of young love, a premise that audiences, old and young, appreciated. So much so, it kept them watching and re-watching. 3. It was an original story that intrigued the general public. Not to mention, it actually helped this time around that the books had a cult following, and even they were happy about the adaptation. It was like, for the first time in a long time, they focused less on what they think Gen Z is saying and doing trend-wise, and just tried to make characters that felt normal. While there was still uses of social media and quirky cliches, it still stayed true to its own story. And maybe I'm a little too optimistic, but I really do believe we can have something like that again. There are scripts longing to be read, actors awaiting to be discovered, and things to be seen that could surprisingly shock us all. It doesn't have to be as hard as streaming services make it out to be. We're not allergic to funny situations, we're just not interested in the ones that feel half-baked. And speaking of that, I'm starting to see visions, and I think it's time for me to sink into my bed now, so thank you all so much for watching, and please be sure to subscribe and all that, and I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye.
Wow.